right. So I want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at the Grand Piano Series once again. We are really excited to bring fantastic artists next week, Manhattan Chamber Players. And Mark Travis is here with us today from New York City. And he will let us know, and talk about the upcoming program. And then we'll be able to have a wonderful conversation with Luke Fleming, who is the founder of the Manhattan Chamber Players. Thank you so much for joining. And be sure to buy your tickets at grandpianoseries.org if you haven't done so. March 30th, we'll have a concert in Naples, Florida, and March 31st in Punta Gorda. Thank you so much, Mark. It's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Milana, as always, and welcome to Luke as well. It's always wonderful when the creators and artists can join us for these pre-concert talks, video podcasts, however you want to think of them. Just a chance to talk a little bit about the music that will be presented this week. It's always my hope that, we can help put some of that music into context and maybe share a couple of fun facts that you might not know. And really looking forward to this particular program, beautiful program of works by Mozart, Debussy, and Dvorak, where we have a multitude of ensembles represented and a multitude of textures represented, and, music maybe a little bit lesser known to music that is extremely familiar, especially to people that enjoy chamber music. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a couple of slides prepared, just as some aid. There we go. So just a reminder that these concerts will involve the Manhattan Chamber Players with the Grand Piano Series' own Milana Strezeva. And again, as she mentioned, good tickets still available at www.grandpianoseries.org. So I mentioned that, there are a couple of different formations that we'll hear as expressed. Chamber music is one of those terms where it's a broad term. It's to sort of describe a genre of music, of anything that was smaller forces than an orchestra, that was usually designed to be played either at the request of a particular noble or aristocrat, or just somebody that could actually afford, maybe they were Michael Haydn's neighbor and they just happened to have enough to convince him to write a piece for their musical family. And it was music that was, enjoyed in a variety of contexts. Usually, it could be like what we would call like a living room concert today. And one of the things that I think attracts a lot of musicians to chamber music, as someone who's worked a lot with large ensemble groups over the course of my career, one thing, ask any orchestra musician, and they are, in my experience, they are thrilled for any chance that comes along where they can play chamber music. And why? And we'll ask Milana and Luke to talk on this more. But, it's this idea of it's a different way to communicate. There's an intimacy that's present that isn't always possible with a larger ensemble, particularly ensemble with a conductor. The players all have to kind of rely on one another. There's a familiarity that, that is encouraged, necessary, to really be able to come together as one voice. And it's a really beautiful world to live in. Vocalists, might have a similar experience, singing in small ensemble choral pieces as well. So in these concerts, we're going to hear a duo, we will hear an actual string quartet, and then we'll hear a quintet. So a few different combinations of instruments, but all, fall under this heading of chamber music. So we begin with the string duo number 1 in G major for violin and viola by Mozart. Now, this piece is written in the summer of 1783 And it's kind of a funny story in that Mozart writes this piece actually to help out Michael Haydn. Michael Haydn was the younger brother of Franz Joseph Haydn, who, of course, was a very generous colleague and influence to Mozart and to so many others. And Michael Haydn was no slouch himself as a composer and particularly as a teacher. We think from letters that, maybe he struggled a little bit with some substance abuse things, and that may be why his star never quite rose, as high as his older brothers. But, Carl Maria von Weber was one of his students. Anton Diabelli was one of his students. He definitely was also a very important voice in the music making community of that time. So Michael Haydn gets sick and, is kind of in a pinch because he's writing these pieces at the request of the Archbishop Colloredo. If you've ever seen the film Amadeus, not that it's a historic document, but just to give you some visual context, you might remember kind of the storyline of Mozart's struggles with this archbishop. That was not fiction, perhaps the way it was it unfolds, is fiction, but they were definitely at odds. And, the archbishop was kind of a difficult person, known to be a difficult person. So Michael Haydn does not want to miss out on this commission. So he asks his younger pal Mozart, gee, man, can you help me out here? And Mozart ends up writing two pieces that are kind of part of this original commission, and the archbishop is never in on the gag, so even though, it's Mozart's writing, can probably tell clearly that it's, signature Mozart's writing. Importantly, the archbishop was none the wiser for this little bit of a ruse. And so, we have these two pieces. Very often they're performed together, Mozart's contribution. But in this case, we'll hear it as all by itself. So written in 1783, it's cast in three movements. And one thing that's interesting here, too, is that Mozart, both Mozart and Michael Haydn kind of, write some double stops into the viola part. But Mozart also adds like 16th notes and some virtuosic passages. And that was a little bit unusual for that time. And it kind of reflects, where Mozart's heart was. By most accounts, we think that Mozart really enjoyed playing the viola, and that it seemed to be, kind of among his favorite instruments, at least of those that he performed. Clarinet, we kind of think, was his favorite overall. But, so it's really and truly the viola and the violin are treated more like artistic partners, in a way that we don't necessarily see very often in music of this period. And so that's also a bit distinct. So let's hear just a little bit of this, Milana, if you would. Let's go ahead and start right at the beginning, the Allegro written in common time. Good. Yeah, that's probably enough to give us a little bit of a taste. So, we can hear just how strong that viola part is. One thing, especially in a series that we call the Grand Piano Series, that sometimes does get overlooked with Mozart, I think, is the fact that he was really a fine fiddler, as well as a pianist. It really was a very big part of his life and, his musical life, playing chamber music with Dad, with his sister. And, it's not kind of something that he just also did, but, he really was a really fine violinist. We occasionally see examples of people, who are comfortable on multiple instruments, but it's increasingly rare, especially at a certain level. I can think of Conrad Tau, who's a wonderful pianist and also can play a mean Sibelius violin concerto. Julia Fischer, the Munich-born violinist, very famously shocked the world one day when she pinch hit for somebody in the Grieg piano concerto. So there are these flashes of that same kind of virtuosity and brilliance in our modern time, but it is something that the violin and the viola were really an important part of Mozart's life as well. One other thing I'll say about the duo, and part of the brilliance of Mozart's writing too, is that it really does lend itself well to transcription. There's a pretty famous transcription where I think all they did was change the clef and lower it an octave and created a piece for cello and violin. And there's also a really, really cool arrangement for two classical guitars of the same piece. And that says also a lot, I think, about just the quality, the brilliance, and the fact that it really is a nice dialogue between the two performers. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen again. He said, hopefully. And let's talk a little bit about the next work on the program. And it's music of Claude Debussy and his one and only string quartet in G minor, Opus 10. Now, there's kind of a phrase that goes about, or a common sentimentality when we talk about music and the history of music, that music forever changed with Debussy's orchestral work, the Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. That it kind of created just this exoticism of both, tonal colors and rhythmic freedom and a number of other, things that it was just unlike anything else that had been heard. Debussy writes that piece in 1894. So we have here a quartet that's written a year earlier, and there are many who would say that this actually is kind of where things changed, and where things certainly changed in the world of chamber music. Debussy kind of fully divorces himself from some of the harmonic and structural conventions of his time when he writes this piece. So, it's what we consider to be kind of a bridge piece to modern music. As I mentioned, it's the only quartet that he completed. He did, we think, have it in mind to write others, but the piece was kind of, the reception of this work kind of ran the gamut from, there were people who thought it was brilliant and, really thought it, saw it for what it was. And then there were other people who are like, how dare he, what does this guy know? What a crackpot. How dare he change all the conventions? Doesn't he know there are rules to the way we're supposed to present this music? And so, Debussy kind of took that to heart. He dedicated it to a fellow composer, Ernest Chausson, and Chausson maybe didn't react with the requisite flattery about that either. So, he was probably a little discouraged, a little cranky about the experience. But that said, boy, are we glad that we have this piece because it really does occupy, I think, a unique place in the quartet repertoire, in the chamber music repertoire, just because of the colors that he manages to paint. There were some who said at the time, that with the exoticism that we hear in this piece and kind of the pushing against some of the boundaries of tonality, that this piece was maybe a product of the influence of a young Russia at the time. And indeed, while we think of her more as a Tchaikovsky patron, Nadezhda von Meck was also present, for this and kind of an early underwriter, for the composer. Let's go ahead and just hear a little bit of it. Here too, I think it's fine to just start at the beginning and just get into this world a little bit, and maybe we'll say a few more words as we come out. Yeah, I think that's a good place to pause. I mean, that's why I wouldn't mind just letting it run for all 26 minutes, of course. But, just think, if you will, to what that must have sounded like to, this audience at the time. We hear it, and we have the benefit of having heard, Alban Berg. We have the benefit of having heard jazz. And so, it sounds just lush and lovely and normal, but what an impression, that must have made, how exciting that must have been for musicians at the time. Pierre Boulez, a great composer and conductor who wasn't always known to be particularly kind in his evaluations of certain composers and tendencies. He had nothing but great things to say about Debussy, and this piece in particular. I had a quote queued up. He said that Debussy, because of Debussy, chamber music is free now from rigid structure, frozen rhetoric, and rigid aesthetics. So clearly an important and influential work to Boulez. It was also a very influential work to Ravel. If you listen to this piece, as I have on programs paired with the Ravel quartet, you can certainly see a lineage there between the two works, and kind of this just gift of color and atmosphere that both composers had. So what a treat that's going to be able to hear this work performed by the Manhattan Chamber Players. So then we'll share one more time to talk about the other work. And this is the one that will involve Miss Milana. And it's by Uncle Antonin Dvorak and his quintet for piano and strings, number 2 in A major. if you were to look up the definition of piano quintet, chances are this is one of the first pieces that would pop up. It's that important to the genre. Really and truly, efforts by Brahms, Schumann, also very important to the piano quintet repertoire, Shostakovich. And those are kind of the biggies. And this is a really, really important piece for this genre. And it's simply, it sounds simple, but it creates its own challenges in terms of the writing to really have things balanced in a equitable way, so that no part overtakes the other parts. And that's a real gift, because what we're doing is we're pairing a string quartet with a grand piano. And, if you aren't careful, it would be very, very easy to end up with a bunch of sounds that just aren't distinct. But in the hands of a master like Dvorak, we really get to hear some nuances and detail. So he writes this piece in 1887. It's premiered a year later. And like a lot of Dvorak's music, Dvorak is very well known through all of the music that he wrote for, including folk elements, from his native Bohemia. And this piece is no different. We hear a furient, which is a very popular dance that, very fast paced. There's another famous furient by Bedřich Smetana from his opera The Bartered Bride. So it's a very popular dance form that we hear. We also hear a dumka. And it's interesting how Dvorak really manages to maintain his own voice while also kind of elevating and incorporating these folk elements. I'm sure that, really and truly he takes it to a next step, until Bela Bartok comes in and takes it, even a step further, along with Zoltan Kodály. What I love is that, Dvorak is another of the composers that was known to be something of a perfectionist. And, I do sometimes muse on the music that we almost had. If only composers had hung on to it, or, had some assistant in their life saying, hey, don't use that for firewood, give it some time. Because, Brahms destroyed a number of his scores. Sibelius was like this close to throwing almost his entire symphonic canon in the fire, and did destroy a number of things. And Dvorak was apparently really, really frustrated, and to the point where he tore up the score that he had written. But a friend of his had a copy of it, and so he decided, he'd been thinking on the piece, what went wrong, what was wrong with it, could he have the copy, and maybe he would start revising it. And what he realized is that let's stop with the revision. Let's just write a new piece. And so I love that, it's sort of born out of a little bit of sweat and agony, on the part of the composer. Again, it is really and truly considered to be just one of the greatest works of its kind. So I mentioned the furient, this fast dance. I think the excerpt I queued up for you, Milana, starts right on that in the third movement. Let's go ahead and hear that, please. Yeah, that's great. And if you think that's lively, get yourself a ticket and hear the finale, because that really, in the right circumstances, can take off as well. Just a really brilliant writing on Dvorak's place, and I know it's going to be played brilliantly by our artists with the Manhattan Chamber Players and Milana. So that is, I think about a good taste, hopefully a few fun facts, maybe things you haven't thought about before with regard to some of this rep. I'm going to turn things over to Milana, and I'd love to have a little dialogue with Milana and Luke, about some things with this program and just the notion of, how they arrived at this program and some of the challenges and joys of performing a program of chamber music.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for your talk. I actually have a few questions for Luke. Luke, I know, I've been watching kind of Manhattan Chamber Players for some time now, and I love the concept, but I actually wanted to talk to you. You are the founder of this group, and please tell us a little bit more about Manhattan Chambers and Players, and how many players are there? How many are you? I know only 4 are coming here, so.
We're a group of about 20 people. We call ourselves a chamber music collective. It is a rather unique organization, but what it kind of stemmed from is, as you know, as a musician, when you're kind of coming up in the musical world, you play with, you get to the point where you're playing with some of the same people year after year at music festivals, or you're in school together and you're playing chamber groups with them, et cetera, et cetera. And we kind of had a core group like that, and everyone was doing their own thing. Like, I played in the string quartet for a long time. Other people did too, or they had solo careers or whatever. And every now and then we would still get to come together and play chamber music. It was rare. But whenever we would always talk about how much we enjoyed it, how much we wished we could do it more often. We always say, oh, we really should do this more often, but never could. And MCP, Manhattan Chamber Players, was formed by me, leaving the quartet I was with at the time to focus solely on MCP, and just deciding, okay, we're going to really take a shot at putting this under an actual official banner and doing it. So the result has been a group of people who've been playing chamber music together for years and years and years, like very long time, longer than they have been in most of their respective groups, like their quartets or trios or whatever. And also a situation where every time we come together, it feels kind of like a special occasion, even though we, over the years, as we've gotten better known, we play more and more concerts. But the people change from concert to concert, depending on who from the roster is available and who I want to assign to a particular piece or repertoire choice. We have 20 members, but generally we're playing in groups of, 4 to 6 players, the kind of standard chamber combinations, piano quartets, string quintets, sextets, string quartets as well. But, we've done concerts where we've done octets before. We have done concerts where we did Copland's Appalachian Spring, which is 13 people. So it's all different combos of players, as you're highlighting in this program, with a duo and then a string quartet and then a piano quintet with yourself. So, and during the year, as we've learned, and as I knew from playing in a string quartet, most series, all they ever present are string quartets and piano trios, because those are the only set formations of groups that typically exist. So audiences get to know all the string quartet repertoire, which is wonderful. It's some of the greatest music ever written, and piano trios as well. But for example, they hardly ever hear piano quartets. We played a piano quartet in a series last week, a very reputable series. And even though I think of Brahms piano quartets as being very standard pieces of chamber repertoire, there's so many people in the audience who just said, I've never heard that piece. I didn't know about it, because they never have piano quartets come and play for them. They're always hearing string quartets. So we're able to delve into the chamber repertoire that people don't get to hear as often during a regular series. So that's kind of been the result of the group.
Well, it's actually perfect for us because since we're grand piano series and the main focus is the piano, the idea is also to bring in chamber music that features the piano and to have this varied programming also for our piano lovers to hear the strings, right, in a duo and a quartet. So I'm really excited about the upcoming program. I know that our audience will enjoy it, and some of them will. Will learn something new for sure because they've been listening to a lot of solo piano works in the last several years, so it will be something fresh and new. Luke, are you based in New York or have you moved away from New York City? Can't hear you. You're on mute. You're on mute. Unmute. Unmute yourself, Luke.
Sorry. I'll level with you. This conversation we're having. I live in New Orleans, actually. That's where I'm from originally, and I moved back here after the pandemic. But I'm in New York all the time for rehearsals and stuff with Manhattan Chamber Players. But actually, right now I'm in the storage room of a church in New Orleans where we're rehearsing. And in fact, I'll take you to rehearsal here. This is a group here rehearsing. Well, they're clearly just warming up. But anyway, as soon as we're done with this conversation, I'll be rehearsing the piano quartet with them.
Is it with Adam?
Yeah, we play all over.
Is Adam playing?
Sorry?
Is Adam playing with you?
Yeah, Adam's with us. He, I think he's in the bathroom right now, which is why they're not. Do you want to say hi to Adam? Do you want me to bring you the?
I heard his recital just a couple of years ago before the pandemic, so I have met him in Naples.
I hear you. I'm gonna stay quiet for a second and hear. Yeah, they're rehearsing Ravel Piano Trio.
That's fantastic.
But I'll be ready to join them as soon as we're done.
One of my favorite works. So it's exciting. You get to travel at the same time. You are a member of the quartet as well, right?
Do you
have a string quartet that you're playing with as well?
No, I used to. I was a member of the Attacca Quartet for 6 years. I left the group to start Manhattan Chamber Players. I'm not a member of a regular string quartet anymore, but I do a lot of subbing. Like I played with the Escher Quartet a couple of times the last season with their violists had COVID at one point, and I've subbed with some other quartets with Modigliani Quartet. Their violist had a visa issue, and they call. So I still get to do some quartet playing, but mostly what I do nowadays is Manhattan Chamber Players. We have enough concerts to where it's mostly what I need. All I need to do to stay afloat.
That's awesome. Can you tell us a few words about your friends who are joining you for the concert in Naples?
Sure. Well, one of them's in there right now, Brooks Belts. He's the cellist of the Escher Quartet. We played together for years and years. We both went to Marlborough Music Festival, which is incidentally where most of the relationships in MCP were formed. Marlborough is a very famous summer festival, 7 weeks long. It's a very intense thing that talented young musicians audition for and go to, and you develop really strong bonds there. So that was how Brooke and I connected, and Adam as well. The other two players who will be in Florida, in Naples, will be Emily Daggett Smith, who's probably the person MCP I've known the longest, because we did our masters at Juilliard together. The first time I went to Japan, I went on a Juilliard tour with Emily, and we played the Mozart violin viola duo there, the G major, the one we're playing for your series. So there's a lot of history. And then the other violinist, Francisco Fulana, also a Marlborough alum. He went a few years after I did. He's a little younger than I am, but he and I were at Juilliard together, and Perlman music program. So that there's all this kind of musical connection and lineage. I run a music festival in New Orleans. They've all been down to New Orleans to my festival as well. So there's a lot of history there. So, and as I said, right now we're actually in New Orleans rehearsing for a different concert. So
wonderful. Well, I'll tell our audience why I decided to invite Manhattan Chamber Players. Some of you know that I was for a long time a pianist at Manhattan Piano Trio. So I figured since I was in Manhattan Piano Trio and then there is Manhattan Chamber Players, we should be able to work really well together and play together. So I'm really looking forward to that experience. I do remember the days when we were in competitions together with Attack String Quartet. I remember that as well. So that was in the past. So now we can enjoy each other's company and have a great time collaborating. So
I'm looking forward to it.
Mark, I don't know if you have any questions.
Absolutely. Well, one thing, Milana, that I was going to ask you is just, the Naples community knows you, and those that know the Manhattan Piano Trio, we know you're a fine accompanist, and we know that, that's a role that, you were able to famously carry out, with, a number of singers. What's the approach when you step into, a piece like this, where you have this enormous instrument before you and you're trying to balance that against the quartet. So what goes through your process? What's the dialogue like with the other players as you try and figure that out?
Thank you, Mark. I think growing up with an opera singer at home and a clarinet player, my father was a principal clarinet player in Moldova Opera House. I've played a lot of chamber music with them, since very early, on in my life. And so the balance is something that I'm always aware of, and I'm always very careful with, be it singers or string players. I know that some pianists, for example, they play with a half stick just to kind of have the balance better. I don't believe in that. I believe one should be able to control the volume with a full stick. So I will definitely be very sensitive to the string instruments, but at the same time, I do believe, in the color palette that is created with, the instrument itself, with the grand piano. So I hope you're fine with that, Luke.
I'm just going to interject. Nobody should ever play with a full stick piano. It's a myth. It doesn't help. It actually just makes it muddier, which in some ways can cover the other instruments more if it's less clear, if it muddies everything up. But they think it makes the piano softer. It doesn't. Piano should always be on full stick. I couldn't agree more.
Great. Perfect.
I'll back that up as a guy who makes recordings too. It's the same thing. Like we would say, no, don't do it that way. Luke, I want to ask you, with a group like this that you formed, you may be in a position that is one that I and some former colleagues would be familiar with, going back to broadcasting, where, working in classical music broadcasting on a daily basis, looking for different sounds, different textures, certain times, what works together, what doesn't work together, where's the compare, where's the contrast, that you want to build. And, with so many players, with kind of this collective of, 20 or so, you have so much repertoire available to you. So I guess, how do you go about, combining things? What's your philosophy and approach to that?
Well, do you mean like how do I select a repertoire perform on?
Yeah, I'm sure some of it's, as you mentioned, is based on who's available, and so that maybe makes it easy. That if you only have 4 players available, but do you go for like contrasting periods? Do you go for?
Sure. Well, we like to think of ourselves as a very presenter-friendly ensemble. Most, from being in a quartet and knowing how quartets work, usually the way it works to our audience at home is that a string quartet will have like 5 or 6 programs that they offer for the season. And a presenter wants to hire them, they look at the program and they pick one that they like. Occasionally they can mix and match. And occasionally they'll request a specific piece and the quartet can make a decision whether they're willing to do that just for that one concert. That's not how we work. We really kind of have it as carte blanche. We have sample programs, but it can be any number of things. Sometimes the presenter wants very specific repertoire. And in this case, Milana very much was in charge of selecting the repertoire. Sometimes a presenter will say, we have, this is our budget. How much will that get us? Like how many players would that entail? And what rep could we do with it? I'd say the most often situation is a presenter has one piece they really want. And then we do that piece, and then I build a program around it. And usually I try to make it have some sort of theme, some sort of common thread, either music written at a specific time in a composer's life, at the end or the beginning of their career. Could be something as simple as that. We did one program one time of all pieces written right after the composer's mother died. It was a very dark program, but there was a common thread. But yeah, it's very much a collaboration with me and whichever presenter to find something they're happy with. I never want a presenter to feel constrained by repertoire possibilities, you know. But I will say that over the years, it has seemed as though we tend to stay within the late classical to late romantic, non-string quartet or piano trio chamber repertoire, because a series, it's actually rare. Like Milana's hired us to do the Debussy quartet. That's rare for us because usually a presenter will hire a string quartet to come and play string quartets. So when we come, they want to hear something that's not a string quartet. So it's a nice treat for us to get to do quartet rep too, because most of us play in quartets or have played in quartets. So it's very much in our wheelhouse. We just don't often get to do it as Manhattan chamber players.
Great.
So.
Milana, I also want to talk to you about, you know, what's the attraction for you as a pianist to chamber music? The pianists are sort of unusual in just how much time they spend alone, with their repertoire and in the practice room. So I wonder, what is it that you enjoy most? What attracts you to have these opportunities to play with the trio or to play with a group like the Manhattan Chamber Players?
Well, I love the collaboration process. I love that feeling of coming together from different places, different backgrounds, and finding this common thread and the feeling of unity and harmony that is very often created with great players, So it doesn't happen all the time, but when it happens, it's magic. And it's incredibly satisfying as a musician to be working with performers who have very beautiful and strong voice on their own, but then they come together and they build this trusting relationship for that particular concert, right? And it happens in time. I mean, it's interesting. I've watched over the years. I've observed multiple different ways of making music together, and some people are very particular in how they rehearse, and they want to make a decision about every single ritardando, every single diminuendo, and they're incredibly specific and they rehearse it to death. I think I find the most satisfying process is when we don't talk, we just play, and music makes, you make music in that particular moment in time, because every time it's going to be different. And I'm sure in the auditorium, when we are on stage, there will be an inspiration, that, the timing is not going to be the same as in rehearsal. So, Luke, I'm just letting you know that in advance. Making music.
I couldn't agree more, especially when you only have a very limited amount of time to put a piece together. Like we're coming down here to rehearse with you a few days early in Naples. And when you're in a situation like that, the best thing to do is to play as much as possible. If you know that you have rules of time to rehearse, then yeah, maybe you could get into like some very specific nitty gritty. But when musicians are talented enough, when you're playing at a certain level, you actually can make it known with what you want with your instrument in some cases way better than you can with your words. So I couldn't agree more. And actually, Marlborough Music Festival was a place that taught me that. I remember when I went there, I had always thought of rehearsal as being something where we stop like every bar and discuss if we're going to take time or what we're going to do in that little spot or whatever. And when I got there, I realized that was just not how things were done there. And my teacher was also there at the time, and he said, hey, you really have to find a way of convincing people of what you'd like to do through your music and not through your words. So I do much prefer that type of music making for sure.
Sounds like we'll have.
I mean, sometimes you have to have a discussion, but if you can avoid it, then great.
Well, yeah, but it's also Mark. I think it's a question of trust, right? When you trust that you are with musicians who are great, and everybody's has. I don't even know how to say it.
Well, I mean, I like to. There's a story. I'll try and tell it in its shortest terms, but there's. Building on your idea of trust, I was talking with Mark Meckler one day, composer and known very well as a frequent collaborator with Pinchas Zukerman as an accompanist. And Mark was telling me the story about listening to some playbacks of him and Pinky, and he fell asleep. And he thought, my gosh, what does this say about this recording, that I fell asleep, during my own playing. And so he went back to the recording engineer and said, hey, can I have the masters back? And, I would like to maybe go ahead and just make my own little edit decision list. And so the engineer was like, sure, have at it. So Mark goes back and talks a little bit with Pinchas and puts together this decision list and, calls the engineer. And the engineer says, well, how many edits do you have for me? And Mark says, well, why don't you first tell me how many edits you had? And he's like, well, I had 529. And Mark replies, well, we have 6. And I think that says it all, that, at a certain level, you start to trust your own musical instincts, you trust your partner, you trust what you're doing together, and the difference between a perfect performance, which is mythical, and a really great performance, so that's that's my contribution to this conversation.
For our audience at home, again, this is something that's actually become very prevalent in the classical music world. You really can't trust anything except a live performance as a representation of how well a group plays because of how many edits they do in studio nowadays. I mean, even with really wonderful performers, it's just this emphasis on things being absolutely perfectly lined up, perfection. And if it's not, it looks like a sloppy recording job. The standard has gotten so high that it's not even real anymore. I have some friends, I'm not going to say what quartet, they were of excellent quartet, like really, really wonderful players. And they recorded something recently. And I said, oh, I'm excited to hear the recording. How did it go? And they said, oh, it's like 600 edits per movement. Like it doesn't even sound like us. It's just, it is what it is. That's just what a recording is now. So, and even when you watch or hear live recordings on YouTube, most of those are edited too. They just edit it and sync it up with the motions, especially when they have multiple camera angles, they can cheat. So you can't really trust anything but a live performance anymore. All the more reason to come to the concert.
100%. That is a good segue. And yeah, no, it's absolutely true. That's what guys like Mark Travis get paid to do when not talking at the Grand Piano Series. Art of illusion sometimes.
Well, Luke, I must say that part of my decision making was definitely seeing live recording videos of Manhattan Chamber Players. So,
those are unedited.
Yes, no, I saw it, and I as a performer and now a presenter, I greatly appreciate it, and I think it's incredibly important to really give a taste of what the group actually sounds like, right? In real live concerts. So I definitely am very grateful for that. One last question, Luke. What food do you like to eat? I mean, the guys in the group. What do we need to prepare for?
Oh boy, we're pretty ravenous eaters in general, especially me and Brooke and Francisco. Emily is a little more picky. She's allergic to just about everything, but I think all of it. I don't think any of us are vegetarians, so you don't have to worry about that. But I know Emily can't have dairy or nuts or about 25 other things. But I'll get all that information to you, I promise. I eat everything though.
Great. Well, yeah, I just want to be mentally prepared to know what restaurants to suggest where to go. Well, I can't wait for you guys to come. When I just wanted to let know our audience when Manhattan Chamber Players are going to be in Southwest Florida. They are doing 2 concerts, and then they're doing multiple community engagement programs in schools, in Title I schools, as well as a private school. So they'll be very busy. It's a very active schedule. We are trying to make the best of their presence, but I'll tell you that whoever is going to show up for a live performance is going to be treated to some phenomenal playing, and I am excited to join you guys as well and make music together, so it will be fun.
We're excited too. Thanks, Milana.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, Luke. Thank you. We'll see you next week. And Mark, we will see you at the next pre-concert talk whenever that happens.
All right. Toi toi.
Thank you, everybody.
Of course.